He read the message 3 times. Each time the words looked softer on the screen as if his mind were trying to blur their edges. But they didn't soften. "Dad, please don't come to the wedding." No explanation, no emojis, just that single line. He sat at the kitchen table, the one that still bore faint coffee rings from years ago when his daughter, Emily, would sneak sips from his mug and giggle when he pretended to be angry. Now, that same table felt colder than the marble it was made from. Outside, the afternoon light fell in stripes across the floorboards. The house was silent except for the low hum of the refrigerator, the sound that always reminded him he was living alone. He scrolled back through the text thread. There wasn't much to read, a few birthday wishes, a picture she'd sent last Christmas of her new apartment, and before that, silence. There had been too much silence between them. It wasn't always that way. There was a time when she would run into his arms after school, her backpack swinging, shouting, "Daddy." There was a time she'd sit on his shoulders at the county fair so she could see the fireworks. But those memories belonged to a different man, a man who hadn't yet become the absent father. The truth was simpler, sadder. He hadn't left them. He'd lost everything, the job, the house, the self-worth that keeps a man standing. And when he couldn't provide, pride told him to stay quiet, shame told him to keep his distance. His ex-wife, Linda, had filled the silence with her own story. "Your father walked away," she'd said. "Your father chose work over family." He never corrected her. At first, he thought the truth would come out on its own, that Emily would grow up and see how hard he'd tried. But time has a cruel way of hardening what's misunderstood. By the time she graduated college, she barely looked him in the eye. When she moved to another city, the calls stopped. He told himself it was okay, that maybe distance was its own kind of peace. Until now, until that text. He read it once more, "Please don't come to the wedding." The words echoed like a door closing in an empty hall. He imagined the ceremony, the music, the vows, the clinking glasses. Somewhere near the front, a seat that might have been his, now filled with someone else. Or maybe left empty, a silent symbol that he didn't belong. He tried to picture her in her dress. He couldn't. He hadn't seen her in person for almost 4 years. Instead, he imagined her as the little girl who once wore a white bedsheet and called herself the Princess Bride. He had laughed, lifting her veil of pillowcase lace. "Someday," he'd said, "you'll walk down a real aisle, and I'll be right there." Now, that promise felt like another thing he had failed to keep. He poured himself a cup of coffee, old habit, and stared out the window. The neighborhood kids were playing baseball on the street. He smiled faintly when one of them missed a catch and laughed anyway. He used to tell Emily the same thing he wanted to tell that boy now. "Don't cry over a missed ball. Just keep playing." It struck him how life didn't give him the same mercy. You can't just keep playing when the people you love stop wanting you in the game. That night, he opened the drawer by his bed and pulled out an envelope, one he'd been keeping for weeks. Inside was a check. He had planned to send it to Emily as a wedding gift to help her pay off the reception hall debt. He'd heard from a friend at the bank, small towns keep no secrets, that the venue payment was still short. Now he wondered if sending the check would only make things worse. Would it embarrass her? Would Linda twist it into something ugly again? He folded the envelope shut and set it back. Maybe love, he thought, wasn't always about showing up. Maybe sometimes love meant not showing up, not making a scene, not asking to be seen. Before bed, he sat once more at the kitchen table. The chair across from him was empty, always empty. He found himself talking into the silence. He whispered, "I know you think I left, but I never did. I just didn't know how to stay." The words drifted into the quiet room and settled there like dust. He wondered if she could somehow feel them, if somewhere, miles away, she paused and thought of him. He didn't know yet that in a few days, at her wedding, that same kind of silence would hang in the air. That the absence of one man would speak louder than 1,000 apologies. For now, there was only the stillness, the hum of the refrigerator, and a father sitting alone at a table, staring at an invisible place card with his name missing. Sometimes love doesn't announce itself with flowers or speeches. Sometimes it waits quietly at the edge of a celebration, unseen, uninvited, yet holding everything that once was, and everything that still hopes to be forgiven. It had rained the morning she left, not a cinematic downpour, just a gray drizzle that clung to the window panes and blurred the edges of everything. David remembered how the house smelled that day: damp carpet, burnt toast, and the faint sweetness of Emily's strawberry shampoo that lingered in the hallway. He could still see the suitcase by the door, the one with the broken zipper he'd promised to fix. He never did. Linda stood in the living room, arms crossed, jaw tight. She wasn't crying anymore. Tears had turned to decisions days ago. Behind her, 7-year-old Emily sat on the couch, clutching a stuffed bear that had seen better days. David spoke first. "Please, Lynn, just don't do this today, not in front of her." His voice cracked on the last word. Linda didn't answer. She reached for the suitcase handle and wheeled it toward the door. The sound of the plastic wheels rolling across the hardwood floor was what broke him. Not the shouting, not the silence that followed. That quiet rattle, that was the sound of his family leaving. It hadn't always been like this. There had been laughter once, music, pancakes on Sunday mornings. But when the factory shut down and David's name appeared on the layoff list, something inside the walls of their home began to shift. Bills started arriving in thicker envelopes. The kitchen arguments grew louder, less about love, more about survival. Linda had always been practical. She wanted certainty. David offered hope instead. "Things will turn around," he kept saying. But hope doesn't pay mortgages. He picked up part-time shifts at the hardware store, then drove deliveries at night. He'd come home after midnight, smelling of gasoline and cardboard, fingers raw from lifting crates. Sometimes he'd peek into Emily's room, watch her sleeping with the nightlight shaped like a moon. He'd whisper, "Hang in there, kiddo, Dad's got this." But he didn't. One morning the bank letter arrived, foreclosure notice. He tried to hide it, but Linda found it in the drawer where she kept their family photos. It felt cruel, the way bad news always seemed to find its way into the most intimate corners of a house. That night the argument wasn't about money anymore. It was about dignity. "You said you'd take care of us," she shouted. "I'm trying," he answered. "Trying isn't enough." Her voice echoed down the hallway, past the framed picture of their wedding on the beach, the one where the wind had caught her veil and made it look like it was trying to fly away. He stared at that picture for a long time after she went to bed. The next morning he pawned his wedding ring and used the cash to cover Emily's school fees. He didn't tell Linda. He didn't tell anyone. That was the start of the silence between them, the kind of silence that doesn't happen all at once, but grows slowly like frost on glass. When the day of the divorce hearing came, he showed up in the same navy jacket he'd worn to his job interview years before. It smelled faintly of old cologne and rain. He'd ironed it twice, as if neatness could make up for failure. Linda didn't look at him in court. Her lawyer did all the talking. "Mrs. Davis will retain custody of the child. Mr. Davis will provide financial support as determined." He signed where they told him to sign. His hand trembled, not from anger, from fatigue. When it was over, Linda gathered her papers, her purse, and left without a word. The only sound was the squeak of her heels fading down the hallway. He sat there long after the judge had gone, staring at the empty chair across from him. The courtroom cleaner came in, carrying a mop. "Sir, we're closing," she said softly. He nodded and stood, leaving behind a paper cup half full of cold coffee. The following week he moved into a small apartment near the train tracks. It wasn't much, one bedroom, thin walls, a flickering light above the sink. But at night when the trains passed, their low rumble reminded him of a heartbeat, something steady, still moving forward. He wrote letters to Emily every month. Some he mailed, most he didn't. He wasn't sure what to say anymore. He wanted to tell her that he missed her first day of middle school, not because he didn't care, but because he was working double shifts. He wanted to tell her that he kept her drawings taped to his fridge like holy relics. He wanted to tell her that he still wore the watch she gave him when she was 6, the one that didn't tick anymore but somehow still kept time. Instead, he wrote things like, "Hope you're doing great at school. I'm proud of you. Tell your mom I said hi." Short sentences for a man running out of words. Years passed that way, quietly, almost politely. Linda remarried. Emily grew up. And David stayed in that same apartment, always meaning to move, never quite managing to. Sometimes he'd see them in town, at the grocery store, at the Christmas parade, and he'd turn away before they noticed. He told himself it was for their comfort, not his. That's the lie good men tell themselves when love turns into distance. One spring afternoon, he saw Emily again by accident. She was crossing Main Street, wearing her college sweatshirt, laughing with friends. For a moment she looked so much like the little girl who used to run through the sprinklers in their backyard that it nearly stopped his heart. He wanted to call out her name. But then she looked right past him, as if he were part of the scenery, something once familiar, now invisible. That was the day he realized he had truly lost her, and in some quiet, weary corner of his heart, he accepted it. He turned the key in his apartment door that night, heard the hum of the refrigerator, and thought about all the promises that die quietly without witnesses. In the years that followed, he never mentioned the divorce again, not to anyone. He simply folded it away like a letter he'd never sent. Outside, another drizzle began, painting the world in soft gray. He stood by the window, hands in his pockets, and whispered to no one in particular, "I'm still here." And the rain, steady, unjudging, was the only thing that answered back. The silence began as something outside of him, a missed phone call, a message left unread. Then quietly it settled inside like dust after a long storm. David didn't notice when it first happened. At least, not in the way one notices a door closing. It was more like noticing that a room feels colder than it used to. He kept his phone on the kitchen counter for weeks after Emily's college graduation, hoping it might buzz. A photo, maybe. A text that said, "Wish you were here." But the screen stayed dark. Eventually he stopped checking. He told himself she was busy, that she was living her life just like he always wanted her to. He tried to make peace with that thought, though it scratched quietly at the edges of his heart. The days took on their own rhythm. He woke early, made coffee in the same dented pot he'd owned for years, and read the morning paper he didn't really care about. Sometimes he'd circle crossword clues just to fill the page, not because he wanted to solve them, but because he liked seeing something, anything, completed. The apartment had its own language. The kettle's whistle, the click of the heater turning on, the muffled thump of his upstairs neighbor walking their dog. Outside, the train tracks cut through the town like a silver scar. When the 5:40 rolled past each evening, its whistle stretched across the horizon, a long, aching note that seemed to echo what he couldn't say. He would pause whatever he was doing then, setting his fork down mid-bite, turning his head just slightly toward the sound. And for a moment, he'd imagine Emily hearing it too, somewhere far away. One Saturday, he visited the grocery store. He didn't need much: bread, milk, a few apples, but he took his time. He liked the small rituals, the squeak of the cart wheels, the faint scent of citrus near the produce section, the sound of someone humming by the bakery aisle. At the checkout counter, the clerk, a young woman with kind eyes, glanced at his items and smiled. "Big plans for the weekend, Mr. Davis." He hesitated. He never got used to people using his name so easily, as if they'd been given permission. "No," he said softly, "just the usual." She handed him the receipt, and he tucked it carefully into his wallet, a habit from a life that used to require tracking every expense. Outside, he noticed a group of college students laughing near the parking lot, tossing a bag of chips between them. Something in their energy made him both proud and painfully nostalgic. He smiled, though no one saw it. That night, he opened his laptop and searched Emily's name. Her photo appeared beside a headline, a feature from her company's blog. "Meet Emily Davis, the new marketing director for Hillstone Events." He read the article twice. She looked confident, happy. There was a quote from her: "Family taught me everything about resilience." He lingered on that word, family. It felt like a window he wasn't allowed to look through. Still, he was glad she was doing well. That was what mattered. He whispered it aloud, as if saying it could make it more real. He kept writing letters, though he no longer addressed them to anyone. They were more like small conversations with the past. "You're probably busy, kiddo. That's good. Busy means moving forward. I still make your favorite pancakes sometimes. Don't laugh, they're less burnt now. If you ever need anything, I'm still here, always here." When he finished, he folded the paper neatly and slid it into a box beneath his bed. Dozens of envelopes lay there, bound with a rubber band. A life's worth of words waiting for a listener. Autumn came, painting the town in copper and rust. He liked walking through the park after work, the crunch of leaves underfoot, crisp air that carried a faint smell of smoke from distant chimneys. Sometimes he'd sit on a bench and watch the sky shift from gold to blue-gray. One evening, an elderly man sat beside him. They nodded in that polite, wordless way strangers acknowledge each other. "Beautiful sunset," the man said. "It is," David replied. The man smiled. "You come here often?" Most days, David answered. Helps me think. Thinking's a dangerous habit, the man chuckled. I gave it up years ago. They both laughed gently. Before leaving, the man turned and said, my daughter used to walk here with me, haven't seen her in a while, but you know what? I still look around every time just in case. After the man left, David stayed for a long time. He realized he did the same thing. Every time he passed a bookstore, a cafe, a flower shop, he looked around just in case. Just in case Emily was there by chance, reaching for the same cup or turning the same corner. It never happened, but hope, he found, didn't need proof to survive. Winter arrived with its quiet authority. Snow fell one morning, covering the street outside his apartment in a pale hush. He stood by the window, holding a mug of coffee, watching as the world turned white. For a moment, the reflection in the glass showed him as he might have looked years ago, younger, hopeful, standing beside a child with bright eyes and unshakable trust. Then the image shifted and he was alone again. He thought about calling her that day. He even picked up the phone, dialed the first few numbers before stopping. What would he say? Hi, it's Dad. Just wanted to hear your voice. No, he couldn't. Not yet. He set the phone down and exhaled slowly. The steam from his coffee rose between him and the window, blurring the snow into a soft glow. There was peace in that, a kind of fragile stillness that didn't ask for more than it could give. He whispered her name once, just to hear it in the quiet, and though the room gave no answer, the sound stayed with him, gentle, unbroken, like the hum of a train fading somewhere in the distance. The news didn't come in a letter or a phone call. It came on a screen. David was rinsing his morning coffee mug when the phone buzzed on the counter. A notification. People you may know. Emily Davis just got engaged. For a moment, the world tilted in silence. He wiped his hands on a towel and stared at the screen as if it might vanish if he blinked too hard. There she was, his daughter, standing beneath a canopy of string lights, a young man kneeling before her, a ring catching the glow like a drop of fire. Her smile was effortless. The kind of happiness that fills a picture so completely it leaves no room for shadows. He felt something twist in his chest, not bitterness, not quite sadness either, something smaller, sharper, the quiet ache of being a stranger to your own child's joy. He clicked the photo open. The caption read, "Forever starts now." There were hundreds of comments, old friends, co-workers, relatives he hadn't heard from in years. Even Linda had written, "So proud of you, sweetheart, you found your forever." He scrolled through the thread until the motion blurred. The sound of the faucet still running pulled him back. He turned it off, the metal handle cold against his palm. In the reflection of the window, he could see his own face faintly overlaid on the image of the engagement photo. Two worlds pressed together that no longer fit. He didn't save the picture, but he didn't delete it either. He left it open on the screen, glowing quietly on the counter while the morning light slid through the blinds. A week later, the announcement appeared in the Hillstone Gazette. His ex-wife had arranged a small feature, local event planner's daughter to wed. There was a picture of Emily in a white dress, not a wedding gown but close enough. Her fiancé, Michael Turner, stood beside her, clean-cut, confident, with the kind of easy posture that suggested he'd never needed to fight for belonging. The article mentioned everything: his career in finance, their shared love for travel, the vineyard where they would exchange vows next summer. Everything except the father. The sentence stopped at Emily Davis, daughter of Linda and the late. No, not late. Just omitted. As if the absence itself had become the polite way to write him out of the story. That night, David walked to the small diner near the train station. It was one of the few places still open late, with cracked red booths and the smell of frying onions that clung to the air like a memory. He ordered a cup of soup he didn't really want and unfolded the newspaper on the table. The waitress, Martha, glanced at the photo and smiled. "She's beautiful, that your girl." He hesitated before nodding. "Yes, that's Emily." "Well, you must be proud." He smiled back, but the motion felt heavy. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I am." She left to refill his water. He stared at the picture again. It wasn't that he didn't want her happiness. He did, more than anything. But there was a strange kind of loneliness in realizing the story of her life was being written in public, and he was no longer even a footnote. The following morning, he opened the mailbox outside his apartment and found a cream-colored envelope addressed to Mr. David R. Davis. The handwriting was neat, deliberate. For a second his heart leapt. Maybe she'd written him after all. Maybe she wanted to reconnect, to invite him properly. But when he tore it open, the words inside were not hers. They were printed, formal. Together with their families, Emily Davis and Michael Turner request the honor of your presence at their wedding celebration. He read it twice before noticing the smaller card tucked inside. This invitation is non-transferable, guest list limited, and at the bottom in smaller ink, please coordinate with Linda regarding seating arrangements. He understood. It wasn't really an invitation. It was an obligation, something sent out of courtesy like an invoice stamp paid in full. Still, he kept the card. He placed it on his fridge, held by a weak magnet beside old bills and faded grocery coupons. Each time he passed it, his eyes caught the gold lettering. It glimmered faintly, even in the dim kitchen light. That weekend, he took the train to Hillstone just to see the venue. He told himself it was curiosity, but part of him knew better. The vineyard sat at the edge of town, rolling hills, rows of vines stretching under the late autumn sun. Workers were setting up scaffolding for lights, testing speakers, arranging chairs in neat white lines. He stayed behind the fence, watching. The air smelled of crushed grapes and damp soil. The wind carried laughter from somewhere up the hill. A young couple passed by him, their hands intertwined. "Looks like a perfect place for a wedding," the woman said. He nodded almost to himself. "Yeah," he murmured, "perfect." That night back home, he couldn't sleep. He kept thinking of the rows of chairs, how they seemed to stretch endlessly under the golden light, how there would be music and clinking glasses, how there would be laughter, toasts, and stories shared. And somewhere in that perfect picture, there would be one empty seat that no one noticed. He closed his eyes, imagining it, a single chair near the front, the way it might catch the light, how it would stand there quietly, neither occupied nor removed, just waiting. He didn't know yet that the image would follow him for months, that it would become the shape of everything he couldn't say. For now it was just a thought, fragile, fleeting, like the echo of a name he hadn't spoken out loud in a long time. The first time David heard the accusation spoken aloud, it wasn't from Linda. It came from someone else, someone repeating it like gossip passed along too easily. He was at the hardware store on a Tuesday morning picking up sandpaper and a new paintbrush. The clerk, a middle-aged man named Carl, had been friendly for years, the kind of small-town face that knew every story before you did. "You must be proud," Carl said, sliding the brush across the counter. "Your girl's wedding's gonna be the talk of Hillstone. Linda was in here yesterday, said she's planning it all herself since you've been out of the picture for, 20 years? The words landed like grit in an open wound. David forced a small smile, pretended to check his wallet. "Yeah," he murmured. "She's always been good at planning." Carl nodded, oblivious. "Well, she said it hadn't been easy, raising Emily alone after you walked out. Guess things turn out how they turn out, right?" Something inside him went still. Not angry, not broken, just still. He signed the receipt, thanked him, and left. Outside, the autumn air carried the faint smell of cut grass and motor oil. He stood by his truck for a long moment, letting the breeze cool the heat in his chest. It wasn't the first time he'd been misunderstood. But it was the first time he realized the lie had become the truth in everyone else's mouth. That evening, he sat at his kitchen table with the newspaper folded beside him. The invitation still hung on the fridge. He hadn't moved it. He didn't know why. He poured himself a glass of water and stared at the condensation sliding down its side. He could almost hear Linda's voice again, sharp, certain, the way she used to speak when she'd already decided how the story should sound. "You left us, David. Don't rewrite history," he used to argue. Then he stopped, because every word he spoke only made him look guiltier. It was easier to let the silence carry his side of the story, even if silence never defended anyone. 2 days later, a package arrived. It was from Emily's company, a courtesy invitation for local media coverage of the wedding. Inside was a press release and a glossy flyer with her photo on it. He ran his thumb along the edge of the paper, careful not to crease it. At the bottom, he noticed a quote from Linda. "It's been a long road raising her on my own, but every sacrifice was worth it." The words sat there in black and white. Official now, permanent. David folded the flyer in half, not out of anger, but because it hurt to see the story of his own life reduced to a single false sentence. He wanted to believe Linda hadn't said it to wound him. Maybe she believed it now, the way people sometimes rewrite pain until it fits the shape they can live with. Maybe to her, he had walked away. After all, she'd never seen what he'd done after she left. the late-night shifts, the bills paid anonymously, the quiet deposits into the old college fund. But truth, he'd learned, only mattered to the people still listening. That weekend he drove past the old house. It looked smaller somehow. The shutters were a different color, sage green instead of white, and there was a wind chime by the porch glinting in the sunlight. He parked across the street, engine off, windows down. The air smelled faintly of lilac. Through the curtains he could see movement, silhouettes in warm light, laughter spilling faintly through the screen door. Linda stepped out with a tray of glasses, her hair shorter now, streaked with silver. A man followed her, tall, gray suit jacket hanging loosely on his shoulders. They looked comfortable, not romantic, just settled. Then Emily appeared. She was holding a folder, her voice confident as she spoke, hands moving animatedly. He couldn't hear her words, but her laughter, that sound, it was the same. It reached him like sunlight through fog. And then he heard it. A neighbor calling out from across the street. "Your mom's a saint, Em. Not many women could have done what she did after he ran off." Emily laughed lightly, didn't correct him, didn't even hesitate, just smiled and waved, her face calm, unaware of the man sitting quietly in the car, hearing his life condensed into a single careless phrase. He waited until she went back inside before starting the engine. The tires crunched softly against the gravel as he drove away. That night he couldn't sleep. The air in his apartment felt heavy, close. He opened a window. The wind carried in the faint scent of rain. On his desk lay a stack of old receipts and letters, the ones he'd never mailed. He shuffled through them until he found one from years ago, a bank statement showing a payment made toward Emily's student loan. He remembered the bank teller asking if he wanted to list his name on the account. He'd said no then, same as he would again. He folded the paper back into its envelope, pressing his palm flat against it. It felt warm, like something alive, a quiet record of everything no one had seen. He thought about writing to her again, but what would he say? "Your mother told them I left. You didn't stop her. You didn't ask." No, he couldn't. Words once spoken couldn't be taken back, and he'd already lost too much to pride and misunderstanding. Instead, he picked up a pen and wrote something else. "If truth ever finds you, I hope it's gentle." He tore the page from the notebook, folded it once, and slipped it into the box beneath his bed. Then he sat there in the dark, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator, the rhythm of a house that never judged him for being quiet. The accusation lingered, not as anger, but as something quieter, a truth rewritten so many times it had become part of the air itself. And he, as always, breathed it in without protest. The letter began as a whisper of a thought. It came to David one night when the rain was tapping gently against the window. Not a storm, just that steady rhythm that made silence feel less empty. He'd been sitting at his kitchen table, the lamp casting a cone of warm light over a clean sheet of paper. The clock above the stove ticked unevenly, filling the space between breaths. He wasn't sure what he wanted to write, only that he needed to. He picked up his pen, paused, and let the ink find its way. "Dear Emily, I saw the news about your wedding. You look happy, and that's what matters. I know I'm not part of your plans, but I still wanted to say congratulations. You probably think I don't deserve to write to you. Maybe you're right. I didn't fight hard enough when things fell apart. I thought giving space meant giving peace. But silence has a way of sounding like absence, and I guess that's what I became." He stopped. The pen hovered midair, trembling slightly between his fingers. His handwriting looked unfamiliar, too neat, as if he were trying to prove he still had control. He leaned back in his chair, listening to the low hum of the city outside, a dog barking in the distance, the faint hiss of a passing car on wet pavement. Life continued without pause, unaware that a man was trying to fit 20 years of love and regret into a single page. He began again, slower this time. "I never meant for your mother to carry everything alone. When the factory closed, I thought it was temporary. I thought I could rebuild before anyone noticed the cracks. But days turned into years, and shame grew heavier than any debt I could pay. I kept sending money for your schooling, small amounts, through accounts that didn't bear my name. Maybe you never knew, that's okay. I didn't do it for credit. I just wanted to make sure you had what I couldn't give in person, a chance to be free of my mistakes." He paused to sip his coffee. It had gone cold, bitter, but he didn't mind. The taste reminded him he was still awake. Outside, the streetlights flickered, turning the window into a patchwork of gold and gray. He thought about how many nights she might have been sitting somewhere like this, in another apartment, another city, not thinking of him at all, and maybe that was the point. Maybe she'd been spared the weight of remembering. The letter stretched past midnight. His words began to wander, tracing paths between apology and memory. "Do you remember the year we built that birdhouse for your science fair? It leaned so much the bird refused to move in, but you still got second place because you painted it bright blue. You told me it was the color of trust. I wish you knew that I tried to keep that color in my life, even when everything else faded." He smiled faintly at the memory. The paint had stained her fingers that day. He'd teased her about it for weeks. The ache that followed was gentle, like an old bruise that still remembered the cause but no longer throbbed. At 2:17 a.m. he stopped writing. The page was full, his script looping and uneven by the end. He read it through once, lips moving silently over each word. Then he folded it carefully and slid it into an envelope. On the front he wrote her name, Emily Davis. No address, no return label, just the name. He held it in his hands for a long time. The paper felt warm from his touch. He thought about sealing it, walking down to the mailbox and letting the night air carry his courage that far. But courage, he found, was a fragile thing at 2 in the morning. It flickered like the weak flame of a match, bright enough to start something, never enough to last. He placed the envelope on the table and turned off the lamp. The room fell into the kind of darkness that remembers everything. The next morning, sunlight spilled through the blinds, landing directly on the letter. The paper looked different in daylight, paler, almost translucent. He picked it up again, reread the first few lines, and something inside him faltered. He imagined her opening it. He imagined her face, the brief flicker of pity, the polite sorrow, or worse, indifference. He could bear her anger, but indifference that would hollow him completely. He set the letter back down. Later, he slipped it into the wooden box under his bed beside the others. It fit perfectly, like it had been waiting for its place among the unsent. That evening, when the train passed behind his building, the whistle sounded closer than usual. He stepped onto the small balcony, the air crisp with the scent of rain-soaked asphalt. The horizon glowed faintly orange, the sun struggling against the clouds before sinking for good. He thought about all the words that never reached their destinations. Letters unsent, apologies unspoken, truths unshared. They drifted somewhere in the air, invisible threads connecting people who no longer looked for them. He rested his arms on the railing, the cool metal pressing against his skin. Somewhere in that same city, maybe across town, Emily was planning her vows, writing her own words of promise and beginning. He hoped hers would find their way, even if his never did. He whispered her name once, so softly the wind almost stole it. Then he went back inside, turned off the lights, and let the quiet return. In the dark, the box beneath his bed seemed to breathe. Not with regret, but with the fragile pulse of love that had nowhere left to go. The night before the wedding carried a strange stillness, the kind that settles before a storm, though the sky was perfectly clear. David hadn't planned to drive out to the vineyard. It just happened. He told himself he only wanted to see the place once from a distance before it filled with music and people, before his absence took shape. The road wound through the outskirts of Hillstone, where fields rolled gently toward the horizon. The air smelled of dry earth and lavender from the wild shrubs that grew along the fences. He kept the window half open. The wind tugged softly at his sleeve. When he reached the entrance, the gates were open, wide and welcoming, though not for him. Strings of lights hung between the trees like golden veins, pulsing gently against the dusk. He parked by the edge of the gravel drive, far enough not to be noticed, and stepped out. The sound of laughter floated from the courtyard, light, layered, familiar in rhythm if not in voice. He followed it until he reached a cluster of trees, their branches heavy with summer leaves. From there he could see everything. Emily stood near the archway, a clipboard in hand, giving directions. She wore a pale blue dress that moved easily with the wind. Her hair was tied up loosely, and a thin strand fell across her cheek when she laughed. Even from a distance he recognized the small habits, the way she pushed that strand behind her ear, the way her hands moved when she spoke. For a moment he forgot to breathe. She was radiant not because of the lights, but because she looked free of everything that had once weighed her down. And that was enough. Enough reason to stay quiet, to keep his distance, to let her have this untouched happiness. He stood behind the trees, half in shadow, half in the soft spill of light from the courtyard. From somewhere close by, the faint scent of roasted rosemary and fresh bread drifted through the air. Someone had started setting the tables for rehearsal dinner. The silverware gleamed like small promises. A man walked up to Emily, tall, broad shoulders, dark suit jacket over a white shirt. Michael Turner. David studied him the way fathers study the men who will take over their daughters' worlds. Michael leaned close, said something that made her laugh again. He rested his hand at the small of her back, a small, instinctive gesture that was both protective and possessive. David felt a strange mix of pride and ache. It wasn't jealousy, just the quiet realization that she now belonged to another orbit, one where he was no longer gravity. Someone called out from the catering tent, "We're short on a bottle of Merlot." The voice was bright, cheerful, and soon joined by the sound of clinking glasses and quick footsteps. Emily turned, gesturing toward a table, and as she moved, the light caught the small pendant at her neck. It was heart-shaped silver and faintly familiar. He squinted. Yes, he remembered it now, her 16th birthday. He'd mailed it anonymously with a note that said, "Every heart needs a compass." She'd never known it was from him. He hadn't expected her to keep it. And yet here it was, years later, resting against her skin like a quiet confession. He smiled, the kind of smile that aches more than it shows. A voice startled him. "You lost, sir." David turned. A young man in a security vest was standing a few feet away, flashlight in hand. The beam caught the dust in the air between them. "Oh, sorry," David said quickly. "I was just taking a look. My niece's wedding tomorrow." The lie came out smoother than expected. The guard nodded, easygoing. "Beautiful spot. They've spared no expense. Guess love's worth it, huh?" David nodded, eyes returning to the glow beyond the trees. "Yeah," he said softly. "It's worth it." The guard smiled and turned back toward the courtyard. David waited until he was gone before exhaling. He stayed a little longer. The rehearsal music had started now, a soft instrumental version of What a Wonderful World. The notes floated over the vineyard, blending with the hum of conversation and the low chirr of crickets. The scene looked almost sacred, a gathering of light, laughter, and promise. It was everything he had hoped her life would one day hold. His hand slipped into his jacket pocket. Inside was a folded envelope, the same one he'd written weeks ago but never mailed. The paper was soft from handling, corners worn. He pulled it out, glanced at the familiar handwriting, Emily Davis. For a moment, he imagined walking across the courtyard, handing it to her, saying her name out loud. He pictured her expression, the surprise, the confusion, maybe even forgiveness. But then another image came, the way Linda might look at him, sharp and guarded, ready to shield her daughter from any ripple of old pain. And suddenly the fantasy collapsed. He slipped the envelope back into his pocket. Some truths, he thought, didn't need witnesses. As he turned to leave, the rehearsal wrapped up. Applause echoed faintly across the fields. Emily hugged her friends, her laughter trailing through the warm air. The sky had deepened into violet now, streaked with a thin crescent moon. David walked back toward his truck, the gravel crunching softly beneath his shoes. Before starting the engine, he looked back once more. Through the rows of vines and the shimmer of lights, he could see her standing there, head tilted, face upturned toward the stars. He whispered a single line into the dark, his voice barely above a breath. "May tomorrow be everything you ever wanted." Then he started the truck and drove away, the faint sound of music following him until it disappeared into the quiet of the road home. The morning of the wedding came quietly. No music, no movement, just light seeping through the blinds, slow and deliberate, touching everything it could before he opened his eyes. David sat up, feeling the stiffness in his back. The air held that muted calm that comes before celebration, as if even the sky knew it should wait its turn. He stared at the suit hanging by the door, the same one he'd worn to Emily's high school graduation. It still fit, though the fabric had dulled at the shoulders. He wasn't going to wear it. He wasn't going to the wedding. But he couldn't make himself put it away either. He poured coffee and watched the steam curl into the stillness. His hands rested on the counter, trembling slightly, not from age, but from everything that had gathered inside him and never found a place to go. The clock read 9:42. By noon she would be walking down the aisle. By evening she would be married. He whispered to himself, as if saying it out loud could make it more real. Today's her day. The envelope sat on the kitchen table, cream-colored, with the bank's logo pressed faintly in silver ink. He'd signed the final papers the day before. The decision had come to him the night he stood at the edge of the vineyard. Watching her laugh under the lights, He'd realized that love wasn't about being seen. It was about making sure she never felt the weight he carried. He'd gone home, opened the old safe beneath his bed, and counted everything he had saved over the years: small pensions, a few bonds, the careful sum of a quiet life. It wasn't much, but it was enough to clear the remaining balance on her wedding loan. Now the paperwork was complete, the debt gone. He took a deep breath, folded the receipt, and slipped it into the envelope. On the outside, he wrote a single line: paid in full, no acknowledgement necessary. He hesitated before adding a second note, smaller, tucked inside: for her happiness, that's all I ever wanted. The bank opened at 10. He drove there slowly, his truck humming against the still morning air. The road curved gently through the outskirts of town, sun warming the steering wheel, soft radio static murmuring in the background. At the counter, a young teller greeted him. Her name tag read Rachel. She couldn't have been older than 25. "Morning, sir. What can I help you with?" He handed her the documents. "I'd like to finalize this payment, the Davis-Turner wedding account." She scanned the paper, typing quickly. "Yes, of course, let me just confirm the details." He watched her expression shift as the screen populated with numbers. Her brows lifted slightly. "You're paying the full remaining balance." "That's right." She paused. "Would you like your name added to the confirmation receipt, Mr. Davis, for records?" He smiled faintly. "No, that won't be necessary." Her fingers hovered above the keyboard. "You're sure it's a large sum? You could," he interrupted gently. "I'm sure." She nodded, curiosity softening into respect. "All right, I'll mark it anonymous. Just a moment." While she printed the documents, David glanced around the bank, the sterile scent of polished tile, the faint echo of heels against marble, the soft buzz of a copy machine. Everything here was precise, labeled, recorded, except this. This one act would belong to no one. Rachel slid the receipt across the counter. "There you go, sir. The account is cleared. Congratulations to the happy couple." He took the paper, folded it once, and tucked it inside his jacket. "Thank you," he said quietly. Then, almost as an afterthought, he added, "And please don't mention this to anyone, not even if someone asks." She blinked, then nodded. "Of course. Your secret's safe." Outside, the sun had grown stronger, pressing against the pavement until the air shimmered faintly. Across the street, a florist was arranging bouquets in the window: roses, lilies, soft sprays of baby's breath. He caught a glimpse of a white ribbon printed with gold letters: "Forever starts now." He smiled. The same phrase from her engagement post. Everything felt like a circle slowly closing. He walked to his truck, opened the door, and stopped. The wedding venue wasn't far, 10 minutes down the road, if that. Part of him wanted to drive there just to see it one last time, to know that she was okay. But another part knew better. He had given what he could. That would have to be enough. The drive home felt lighter. The weight that had followed him for years, of guilt, of absence, of words unsent, had shifted somehow, not gone but gentler. He parked outside his apartment, left the engine running for a moment, listening to the low hum. It reminded him of her heartbeat when she was small and used to fall asleep against his chest after long days in the yard. He let the sound fill the silence before finally turning the key. Inside, he laid the final receipt on the table beside the others: electricity bills, rent slips, grocery lists. Just another record of a quiet man doing what he could to keep life in motion. But this one was different. This one carried her name. He looked at it for a long time, then whispered, not to the paper but to the air around him, to the space that still belonged to her somehow: "You don't owe the world anything, Emily. It's already yours." He slipped the receipt into the wooden box beneath his bed, between the unsent letters and the faded photographs. The lid clicked shut softly. Outside, somewhere in the distance, church bells began to ring, faint, melodic, carried by the wind. He stood at the window, eyes tracing the horizon. He imagined the same sound reaching the vineyard, echoing through the rows of vines, through the music and laughter, falling gently over her like a quiet blessing. He didn't need to see it. He didn't need to be there. Some loves didn't ask for presents. They asked for peace. And in that moment, standing alone in the soft light of his small kitchen, David Davis finally gave himself and her both. The morning sunlight fell like silk over the vineyard. It touched everything gently: the rows of vines glistening with dew, the white chairs aligned in perfect symmetry, the altar wrapped in soft roses and eucalyptus leaves. The air smelled faintly of champagne and freshly cut grass. It was the kind of day photographers call forgiving light: warm enough to flatter every color, soft enough to hide every flaw. Emily stood before a mirror in the bridal suite, her dress a whisper of lace and calm. The room around her hummed with motion. Bridesmaids laughing, the rustle of fabric, a faint buzz from a hairdryer across the room. But inside her chest, there was a different kind of sound, a low, steady pulse that carried both excitement and something else she couldn't name. Her reflection looked composed, but her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the clasp on her pendant. The small heart-shaped locket caught the light, flashing silver across her skin. Linda appeared behind her, holding a bouquet of ivory roses. "You look beautiful," she said, her voice warm but practiced, a mother's tone that had been honed for presentation. Emily smiled through the mirror. "Thank you." There was a pause, brief but heavy. "You're not nervous?" Linda asked. "A little," Emily admitted, "but mostly I feel ready." Linda squeezed her shoulders. "Good, that's how it should be." From outside, the faint sound of a violin drifted in, a soft prelude, a reminder that the day had begun its slow procession toward the moment everyone would remember. Across town, David sat in his truck, parked by the small overlook that faced the valley. From there, if he turned his head just slightly, he could see the edge of the vineyard, a blur of white tents and fluttering ribbons against the hills. He hadn't planned to be that close, but the sound of church bells had drawn him there. He could hear them faintly now, carried by the wind. He rested his hands on the steering wheel, watching sunlight blink off the chrome. The smell of the countryside, dry soil, pine resin, distant lavender, drifted through the open window. He felt calm, in the way one feels when all choices have already been made. The envelope from the bank rested on the passenger seat, its corner slightly bent. He hadn't been able to throw it away. Not yet. He imagined the ceremony, the music beginning, the hush that always follows the first step down the aisle. He pictured her dress, her smile, her voice saying, "I do." He closed his eyes and let the image stay for a while. Then with quiet finality he whispered, "Be happy, kiddo." At the vineyard, guests began to gather. Men adjusted their ties, women straightened hats and dresses, the air filled with perfume and anticipation. The white chairs gleamed in neat rows, and at the front, just to the left of the aisle, one seat remained conspicuously empty. A small name card rested on it, reserved for family. No one asked for whom. It was just there, as if everyone instinctively knew not to touch it. Emily noticed it when she stepped out of the bridal suite. Her eyes flicked toward it, then away, too quickly for anyone else to see. Something in her chest tightened, but she took a breath, steady and shallow. The violin melody shifted. It was time. She took her mother's arm and began walking toward the ceremony lawn. The scent of the flowers grew stronger as they approached, roses, mint. A hint of orange blossom carried on the breeze. Her shoes brushed softly against the path of white petals. Each step seemed heavier than the last, not because of the gown, but because of the quiet awareness that there was one presence missing, not loud, not visible, but missing all the same. As she reached the end of the aisle, the guests rose. Michael stood waiting, face open and hopeful, his eyes crinkling in the sun. For a brief second, everything stilled. The world looked like a painting, motionless, perfect, framed in the light. She smiled, though her throat felt tight. When the officiant began to speak, his words came softly through the air, weaving through the rustle of leaves and the distant hum of bees. Emily caught fragments: promise, faith, for better or worse. But her mind drifted. She thought of the small, quiet things. The birthday card that had arrived years ago with no return address. The pendant she still wore, the one from her 16th birthday, though she'd never told anyone why. The way her mother's voice sometimes faltered when the topic of her father came up. She had never asked for the full story. And now, standing here, surrounded by love and sunlight, she wasn't sure she wanted to. The vows began. Michael spoke first, steady, sincere. His words filled the air like warm light. Then it was her turn. She took a small breath, her voice trembling just once before she steadied it. Her vows were simple, about trust, kindness, and patience, the kind of words that sound easy until life asks you to prove them. As she finished, applause broke out softly, followed by laughter and the clinking of glasses as champagne was passed around. The sound wrapped around her like music, but beneath it all she heard something else, a low, distant hum, a car engine fading down the road beyond the hills. For a heartbeat, she looked past the guests, past the tents, toward the distant bend where the highway curved. There was nothing there, only the shimmer of heat rising from the pavement. But for reasons she couldn't explain, her eyes filled. She blinked, smiled, and turned back toward the altar. The ceremony ended in cheers and petals thrown into the sky. Emily and Michael walked back down the aisle, her hand tight in his. When they passed the front row, she glanced once more at that empty chair. The card had fallen to the ground. She bent slightly, picked it up, and tucked it into her bouquet. No one noticed, not even her mother. The music swelled, bright and full, and above it all, carried faintly through the open valley, came the echo of the last church bell, slow, distant, and tenderly precise, like a heartbeat that had kept its promise from afar. The reception had begun to soften into evening. The sun hung low over the hills, spilling amber light across the vineyard until everything, the tables, the glasses, even the white tent above them, seemed to glow from within. Music drifted through the open air, slow and nostalgic, the kind that made people sway without realizing it. Laughter rose and fell like waves. The clinking of cutlery, the occasional pop of a cork, the rustle of dresses brushing against gravel, the sounds of a life in celebration. Emily sat at the head table, her hand resting lightly on Michael's. She was smiling, radiant, but her eyes kept moving, scanning the crowd, pausing every so often at the same place, that single empty chair near the front. It stood out more now that the light had shifted, a dark silhouette against the glowing tables. Someone had left a glass of water there, untouched. The condensation traced small circles onto the linen. A napkin, folded neatly, waited beside it. During the ceremony, she hadn't allowed herself to think too much. Everything had moved too quickly, the vows, the applause, the photographs. But now, as the evening unfolded and the guests began to relax, the emptiness of that chair grew louder in her mind. She could hear her mother's laughter at another table, the high, effortless kind that came easily when others were watching. She could hear Michael talking with one of his uncles about their honeymoon plans. Yet through it all there was that quiet, unmoving space, a single seat untouched by joy. A few guests had asked about it earlier. Her mother had waved them off. Just a mix-up in the seating chart, she'd said, but Emily hadn't corrected her, because she knew it wasn't a mix-up. She'd seen the place card herself that morning. It hadn't carried a name, only one word, reserved. As the night deepened, lanterns flickered on, suspended between the vines like small suns. The air smelled of sweet wine and candle wax. Someone began a toast, his voice thick with warmth and too much champagne. Glasses lifted, shimmered, caught the light. "To love," he said, "and to the people who make us who we are." Emily smiled automatically, but her chest tightened. She found herself glancing again toward that chair. In the shifting light it seemed almost occupied, as if memory itself had taken a seat. A breeze moved through, gentle but insistent. The napkin fluttered slightly, and she thought absurdly that someone might have brushed against it while sitting down. For a heartbeat she could almost feel it, a quiet presence, patient and kind. Michael leaned close. "You okay?" She nodded, forcing a small smile. "Yeah, just tired." He squeezed her hand. "Big day, you deserve to rest." She didn't tell him what she was really thinking, that there was a weight she couldn't name sitting somewhere inside her ribcage, a hollow that celebration couldn't fill. Because how do you explain missing someone you've spent years pretending you don't miss? She looked toward her mother again. Linda was deep in conversation with a guest, her expression animated, her hand slicing the air with practiced elegance. Emily wondered if her mother noticed the chair at all, if she saw it, or if she'd trained herself not to. Later, when the first dance began, the music shifted. The violin softened into something tender, and guests gathered around the floor. Michael held out his hand. "Ready, Mrs. Turner." The title made her laugh, light and nervous. She took his hand, and the crowd clapped as they began to move. But halfway through the song her eyes found that chair again. A lantern hung directly above it now, its light golden and unsteady. She could see dust motes floating in the air, catching the glow like slow sparks. Something inside her loosened. Not a tear yet, but the ache that comes before one. She remembered the way her father used to guide her feet on top of his when they danced in the living room. The scratch of his flannel shirt against her cheek. His quiet voice saying, "Don't count the steps, Em. Just listen to the music." The memory came so vividly she nearly stumbled. After the song ended, she excused herself and walked toward the empty seat. The crowd was busy now, caught up in conversation and laughter. No one noticed her move away. She stood by the chair, hands clasped in front of her. Up close it looked ordinary, white, wooden, the same as the others, yet it carried a gravity that pulled her still. The water in the glass had grown warm. The napkin was slightly damp where the condensation had reached it. She reached out, fingertips brushing the fabric of the chair's backrest. It was cool, smooth. She closed her eyes. In the space of that silence, the sounds around her seemed to fade, replaced by something quieter. The faint creak of floorboards long gone, the echo of a man's voice saying her name with pride, the hum of a life that had once revolved around hers. For a second she could almost hear it again. The rhythm of his breath, the weight of his hand resting gently on her shoulder. The air thickened, carrying the faint scent of cologne she hadn't smelled in years. Her heart clenched, and the tear she'd been holding finally slipped free. When she opened her eyes, the chair was still empty, but it didn't look lonely anymore. It looked held. Someone had noticed her from afar, Michael perhaps, but he didn't approach. He seemed to understand that this was a moment untouched by the rest of the night. Emily bent down slightly, whispering, "I wish you were here." Her voice barely carried past the rim of the table, but somehow saying it made the air feel lighter. The music picked up again, louder this time, joyful. She turned away, wiping her cheek before anyone could see. As she walked back toward the crowd, the lantern above the empty chair flickered once, then steadied, casting a gentle circle of light that stayed long after she was gone. By the time the last song faded, the vineyard had fallen into that gentle quiet that comes after celebration. Tables were half cleared, candles burned low, and laughter lingered in small, exhausted bursts. Guests drifted toward the parking lot in pairs, their shoes clicking softly against the gravel. The sky had turned indigo, carrying the faint chill of approaching night. Emily sat alone for a moment beneath the canopy of lights. Her bouquet lay beside her, petals wilting slightly, the perfume fading into something softer. The adrenaline of the day had begun to wear off, leaving behind a strange stillness, not sadness exactly, but the kind of emptiness that follows something perfect. She looked again toward the front row. The empty chair was still there, untouched. The napkin had slipped to the ground, now damp with dew. She thought about picking it up, but didn't. She told herself the night was over, the questions could wait. Tomorrow everything would feel simple again. Tomorrow she'd be a wife, a daughter, a new beginning. The next morning, sunlight poured through the window of their hotel suite, sharp and too bright. Michael was still asleep, one arm draped lazily over the blanket. The room smelled faintly of flowers and champagne. Emily slid out of bed quietly, bare feet brushing against the cool floor. A soft knock came at the door, hesitant, polite. She opened it to find a young woman from the event staff holding a clipboard and a few envelopes. "Good morning, Mrs. Turner," she said, smiling. "Congratulations again. I just wanted to drop off the final invoice summary from the venue. Your coordinator said everything went perfectly." Emily took the folder. "Thank you." The woman hesitated, then added, "Oh, and this came in late yesterday evening. It was marked urgent, so I figured I'd pass it along." She handed Emily a sealed envelope with the vineyard's logo on the front. Inside, a single piece of paper. The woman's tone softened. "It's a payment confirmation, I think. Everything's been cleared." Emily frowned slightly. "Cleared?" "Yes, ma'am. The balance for the event was paid in full." After the woman left, Emily sat on the edge of the bed and unfolded the receipt. Her eyes moved down the neat black text. It listed the final balance, and then in the section marked payment source she saw it. Account holder, anonymous. Transaction reference, Davis/Turner Wedding. Amount, paid in full, verified by Rachel Morgan, branch representative. She blinked, reading it again as if repetition might change what she saw. Her stomach tightened, her breath caught halfway. Michael stirred behind her. "What's that?" he mumbled. "Nothing," she said quickly, "just paperwork." She folded the receipt back into the envelope and pressed it to her chest for a second, as if trying to steady her heartbeat. Anonymous. She thought of her mother, always precise about finances, always in control. But Linda had been very clear, the loan would take months to pay off. She complained about it more than once. So who? The thought finished itself before she could stop it. Her hand trembled slightly. Later, when she went downstairs for breakfast, her mother was already there, chatting with the venue manager. Sunlight gleamed off the crystal glasses on the table. Linda looked refreshed, proud, as if the night had washed away every worry she'd ever had. Emily waited until the manager walked away before sliding the envelope across the table. "What's this?" her mother asked. "Payment confirmation. From the bank." Linda's smile didn't falter, but her eyes flicked down, scanning the paper. When she reached the bottom, her face changed just slightly, a twitch near her mouth. "Well," she said finally, folding it neatly. "Looks like someone handled it, maybe a clerical mistake." Emily stared at her. "Mom, it wasn't a mistake. It says anonymous. You didn't pay it, did you?" Her mother looked out toward the courtyard, her tone turning careful. "I told you not to worry about those things. It's taken care of, that's what matters. Who would pay for our wedding?" "Mom?" "Emily," she said softly, "don't start this today. You're married now. You have a future to think about." But the words didn't land. They only made the silence between them heavier. Back in the hotel room, Emily sat at the desk and turned the receipt over and over in her hands. The paper crackled faintly, like it was alive with a truth too fragile to say aloud. Her gaze drifted to the corner of the room where her bouquet rested in a vase, white roses, petals beginning to curl at the edges. She thought of the pendant at her throat, the one she'd worn without question. She thought of the empty chair under the lantern's light, how it had seemed to hold something invisible yet certain. A realization began to take shape, slow and steady as dawn spreading over a field. Her father. The thought wasn't dramatic. It didn't strike her like lightning. It arrived quietly, the way dawn enters a dark room, soft, undeniable, complete. He hadn't come, but he had been there. She could see it now, the quiet care, the unseen hand that made sure her happiness was whole. He had left no note, no signature, no clue except the absence of one. A love without name, but impossible to mistake. She unfolded the receipt once more and touched the ink with her fingertips. The faint texture of the print, the seal pressed at the bottom, tangible proof of something invisible. She exhaled slowly, and the sound came out as half a sigh, half a sob. Michael returned from the shower, towel around his neck, humming absently. He looked at her, saw the paper, and paused. "What's wrong?" She wiped her cheek quickly. "Nothing, just something I didn't expect." He walked closer, resting a hand on her shoulder. "Good news or bad?" She looked down at the receipt again, at the words "paid in full." Her voice was quiet, almost reverent. "Both," she said. Then she folded the paper carefully, slid it into the back of her journal, and closed it with both hands, as if tucking away something sacred. Outside, the church bells began to ring again, echoing faintly through the hills. The same bells that had sounded yesterday. The same ones, she realized, he must have heard too. She turned her face toward the window, eyes glistening in the new light, and whispered the words she wished she'd said before the wedding, words that now belonged to no one and everyone all at once. "Thank you, Dad." It started with a sound, a soft, uneven rhythm, the kind that lives somewhere between breathing and crying. Emily didn't notice it at first. She was sitting at her desk in the quiet of their new apartment, flipping through the wedding photos on her laptop. The images glowed on the screen, her smile wide, Michael's hand firm around hers, guests clapping in a haze of golden light. Everything looked perfect, but then she reached the one photo she couldn't stop staring at. The shot of the ceremony captured from the back row. The aisle looked like a river of white petals, her veil shimmered, her mother smiled beside her, and just beyond the altar, under the soft canopy of lanterns, that single chair, empty. Something inside her chest trembled. She zoomed in until the pixels blurred, but it didn't help. That space was still there, untouched, undeniable. The sound she heard was her own breath breaking. She closed the laptop and stood up, her legs unsteady. The room felt smaller suddenly, the air thick. Michael was in the other room unpacking boxes, humming faintly to himself. She didn't call him. Instead, she opened the drawer where she'd hidden the receipt. The paper was still there, folded perfectly, its edges sharp. She unfolded it again, even though she knew every word by heart. Paid in full, verified by Rachel Morgan, branch representative. She read the line aloud this time, her voice trembling slightly. Anonymous. No signature. No acknowledgement necessary. She thought of the years, birthdays that came with no calls, graduations where his seat stayed empty, stories her mother had told to fill in the silence. And now this. A man she hadn't spoken to in over a decade had reached across that silence, not with words, but with an act so simple it unmade everything she thought she knew. She sank into the chair, clutching the paper in both hands. Her breath came shallow, uneven. It wasn't just guilt that rose in her, it was recognition. She had spent years defending a version of the truth that no longer held. When Michael came in, she didn't hear him at first. He stood in the doorway, still holding a small box of glasses. She looked up, startled, eyes wet. He set the box down carefully, the glass clinking against wood. What happened? She handed him the receipt without speaking. He read it once, frowning slightly. "This is the same one from yesterday, right?" She nodded. "And you think it was your dad?" Her voice cracked on the answer. "I don't think I know." Michael sat down across from her, the kind of silence that follows truth settling between them. He didn't reach for her right away, he just let her breathe. After a long moment she whispered, "He wasn't even invited, Mike. My mother made sure of it." And still, her throat tightened. "Still he paid for everything." Michael's face softened. "Maybe that's how he knew to love you." The sentence landed like a soft hammer, gentle but devastating. She covered her face with her hands, the sob that came out of her sharp and raw, the kind that surprises even the person crying. When it passed, she felt hollowed out. Not broken exactly, just emptied of something heavy. Michael rose, walked to the kitchen, and returned with a glass of water. "Here," he said. She took it, her fingers brushing his. The water was cool, grounding. "I need to see him," she said finally. "Today," she nodded. "If I wait, I'll lose the nerve." Michael didn't try to stop her. He only said, "Then go, I'll drive." They reached Hillstone just before dusk. The sky was turning that shade of copper that lives between day and night. As they drove past the old streets, Emily recognized everything and nothing at once: the diner, the hardware store, the corner where she'd waited for the school bus. Her hands were cold in her lap. When they reached the narrow road near the train tracks, she saw it, the small building with the peeling paint, the mailbox crooked from weather. His apartment. She asked Michael to wait in the car. He nodded once. Her legs felt heavier the closer she got to the door. The hallway smelled faintly of coffee and varnish. Somewhere upstairs, a television played an old baseball game. She stopped in front of his door. Apartment 2B. The brass numbers were dull but clean. For a moment she just stood there, breathing. Then she raised her hand and knocked. There was no answer at first. She almost turned away, almost convinced herself that silence was its own kind of forgiveness. But then the door opened, slow and cautious. He looked older than she remembered, thinner, his hair more gray than brown. But the eyes, soft, kind, startled, were exactly the same. "Emily." Her name came out like a prayer and a question. She tried to speak, but the words caught. Her throat tightened. He stepped back automatically, as if afraid she might vanish if he moved too fast. "Come in," he said quietly. She did. The room smelled faintly of cedar and coffee. On the small kitchen table sat a wooden box, half open, filled with letters, dozens of them, neatly folded. Her eyes went to it instinctively. He followed her gaze. "They're yours," he said. "Everyone I couldn't send." Something in her cracked. She took a step forward, then another. And before she knew it, she was crying again, not with restraint this time, but with years of unsaid things spilling out at once. He reached for her, unsure at first, his hands trembling, then held her the way a man holds something fragile and sacred. Neither spoke for a long time. The air between them felt different, not fixed, not perfect, but real. When she finally looked up, her voice was small but certain. "You didn't have to pay for it." "I know," he said. "That's why I did." The room fell quiet again, filled only by the ticking of a clock somewhere in the corner. It was the same rhythm she remembered from childhood, steady, unhurried, patient. For the first time in years, she let herself breathe in time with it. The following evening, rain drifted across Hillstone like a quiet apology. It wasn't a heavy storm, just a soft, steady drizzle that turned the streets silver and made every light shimmer twice, once on the pavement and once in the air. David stood by his window, coffee mug in hand, watching the drops slide down the glass in uneven lines. His small apartment felt warmer than usual, filled with that faint, earthy smell that came after rain. He wasn't expecting company. He never did anymore. The knock came softly, 2 quick taps, hesitant, almost unsure if it belonged. He frowned, setting his cup down. When he opened the door, Emily was standing there. Her hair was damp, clinging to her face in dark strands. A coat hung over her shoulders, rain-soaked at the edges. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They simply looked at each other, two people who had spent a lifetime on opposite sides of silence, suddenly finding themselves within reach. "Hi," she said finally. Her voice was quiet, careful, as if testing the shape of the word in this space. He swallowed hard. "You're here." "I am." The words sat between them, simple and impossible all at once. He stepped aside, opening the door wider. "Come in before you catch a cold." She smiled faintly. Still saying that, she murmured and crossed the threshold. Inside, the apartment was small but tidy. A lamp glowed softly in the corner, casting a warm circle of light over the old wooden table. The scent of coffee lingered, mixed with the faint metallic hint of rain carried in from the hall. Emily glanced around, her eyes moving slowly over the familiar unfamiliar, the same kind of chair from their old house, the same framed photograph of a younger her, smiling, missing a front tooth. He'd kept it all these years. "I didn't think you'd still live here," she said. He poured her a cup of coffee without asking. "I like quiet places, they don't ask for much." She took the mug, wrapping her hands around it. "You always did drink too much coffee." He smiled, a small, tired curve of the lips that carried more memory than words. "Guess some habits survive even when people don't." She looked down at her cup. "Dad." He froze at the word. He hadn't heard it spoken aloud by her in years. When he looked up, she was watching him, her eyes glassy but steady. "I'm sorry," she said. The sentence hit the room softly, but it filled every corner. He opened his mouth to answer, then closed it again. She went on, her voice trembling only slightly. "I spent years believing what Mom told me, that you left, that you stopped caring. I never asked for your side. I thought it didn't matter, but it did." She pulled a folded paper from her bag and set it on the table, the receipt. "I found this. It was you, wasn't it?" He didn't touch it. He just nodded. Her eyes filled again, though her voice stayed even. "You didn't have to do that. You didn't owe me anything." He shook his head. "You're wrong, Em. I owed you everything." The rain outside pressed gently against the windows, the sound like a steady heartbeat. She looked at him for a long moment, as if trying to memorize every line of his face, the lines near his eyes, the gray threading through his hair, the way his hands folded gently when he spoke. He was older, yes, but he was still him. "I thought you hated me," she whispered. He exhaled softly, almost a laugh. "I never could. I just didn't want to make your life harder. Sometimes love means staying far enough away not to ruin what's left." The words trembled slightly, worn smooth from years of being unsaid. They sat in silence for a while, each lost in their own unfinished sentences. The clock on the wall ticked softly, its rhythm blending with the rain. Finally, she reached out, her hand finding his across the table. Her skin was cool, damp from the rain. His was warm, dry, calloused from years of quiet work. For a moment, neither moved. "Dad," she said again, voice lower now, raw, "I don't want us to be strangers anymore." He turned his hand, fingers closing gently around hers. His thumb brushed the edge of her wedding ring. "You're not a stranger," he said. "You're just home after a long detour." Her breath hitched. The tears that followed weren't loud, they were soft, trembling, like the kind that come when the body finally realizes it's safe to feel again. He didn't comfort her with words. He simply stood, walked around the table, and rested a hand on her shoulder, a touch years overdue but steady and sure. She leaned into it, eyes closing. After a while, the storm eased. The air through the window was cool and smelled faintly of wet earth and pine. They sat together on the couch, sharing the same blanket, neither needing to fill the space with conversation. On the table, her untouched coffee had gone cold. He noticed but didn't mention it. Some things, he knew, were meant to cool before they were ready to be remembered. Emily glanced at the wooden box on the shelf, the one with the letters. "Can I read them?" He hesitated, then nodded. "All of them if you want." "Not now," she said softly. "Later, when I can do it without crying." He smiled. "Then we'll wait." The rain had stopped completely now. The clouds had lifted, revealing a thin silver of moonlight that slipped through the window and stretched across the room. It landed between them like a quiet bridge. And for the first time in years, father and daughter sat on the same side of it, the past behind them, the silence finally at rest. It had been 3 months since that night, the rain, the trembling apology, the quiet reconciliation. Time had not erased anything, but it had softened the edges. The days felt gentler now, threaded with small gestures instead of silence. Emily visited often. Sometimes she brought coffee, sometimes just conversation. They didn't talk about the missing years too much. Those wounds didn't need reopening. They simply existed together, two people learning how to speak again without flinching. David had taken to fixing up the small porch outside his apartment. He'd built a new chair, sturdy and plain, painted a deep walnut brown. It sat next to his own seat, facing the train tracks that stretched toward the horizon. When Emily visited, that was where they sat. They would watch the late afternoon light fade over the rails, talking about nothing and everything, how the gardenia by the door had started to bloom, how Michael was adjusting to married life, how the world seemed quieter when you finally stopped running from it. It became their ritual. One chair for the man who had waited, one for the daughter who had returned. But on this particular evening, as the first chill of autumn crept into the air, the porch felt different. Emily sat in her usual chair, holding a mug between her palms, steam curling against the pale light. David wasn't outside yet. She could hear him moving inside the apartment, the sound of a drawer closing, the slow shuffle of feet across the wooden floor. When he stepped out, she noticed the change immediately. He looked tired, paler than usual, but he was smiling, that soft, lopsided smile that had begun to feel like home again. "You okay?" she asked. He nodded, settling into his seat with a quiet sigh. "Just one of those days, the kind where you feel every year you've lived." She smiled, though her heart twinged. "You're allowed to have those." They sat for a while, the air filled with the hum of distant crickets and the faint metallic echo of a passing train. David's gaze drifted toward the second chair, the one he had built for her. He tapped its armrest lightly, as if testing its strength. "Funny," he said. "I spent years looking at an empty chair and thinking it meant I'd lost something. Now every time I see this one filled, I realize it was never the chair that was empty, it was me." Emily didn't answer right away. Her throat felt thick. She reached across the small space between them and rested her hand over his. "You're not empty anymore." He looked at her, eyes bright in the fading light. "No," he said softly, "not anymore." Later, after the sky turned indigo, she went inside to wash the mugs. When she came back out, his chair was empty. At first she thought he'd gone to get a blanket, the air had cooled suddenly. But when a minute passed, then another, unease crept in. She stepped closer to the chair, still warm where he'd been sitting, the faint scent of cedar clinging to the air. "Dad," no answer. She moved inside, calling again. The apartment was quiet, too quiet. And then she saw him near the kitchen table, one hand resting on the counter for balance, the other clutching his chest. His breathing was shallow, eyes unfocused, skin pale as paper. "Dad," she rushed to his side, catching him as he sank slowly to the floor. Hey, look at me, stay with me, please." He tried to smile, but it came out weakly. "Guess I just ran out of time for the easy years." "Don't say that," she choked out, grabbing her phone. "You're going to be fine, okay? Just stay with me." He reached for her wrist, his grip surprisingly steady. Listen." Her tears blurred his face. "Dad, please, don't be afraid of the empty chair," he whispered. "It's just a place to rest until someone sits again." His fingers slipped slowly, like sand falling through an open hand. The ambulance came fast, its lights slicing through the night. Neighbors stood in doorways, faces drawn in sympathetic silence. Emily rode beside him, holding his hand as the paramedics worked. Voices clipped, urgent, clinical. She whispered his name over and over, like a prayer she didn't remember how to end. At the hospital, time folded in on itself. Minutes bled into hours, and when it was over, the doctor's words fell softly, almost respectfully. He went peacefully. The phrase hung in the sterile air like something too fragile to touch. A week later, the porch still faced the same horizon. The two chairs sat side by side, unmoved. One held a blanket she'd left draped across it. The other, his, remained empty. She came often, bringing coffee, sitting in silence. Sometimes she would talk to him softly like she used to, as though the air might carry her words somewhere he could still hear. The wind would stir then, gently, brushing the leaves, making the chairs creak against the wooden boards. It almost sounded like an answer. She didn't cry every time. Some visits she even smiled, remembering the way he'd laughed when she told him she burned the first meal she ever cooked, remembering how he used to hum when the trains passed, remembering how, for a short while, the chair had been filled again. One evening, as she sat watching the sunset, the same copper glow they'd shared so many times, Michael came out to join her. He rested his hand on her shoulder. "You ready?" he asked softly. "Not yet," she said, eyes still on the horizon. "Maybe in a minute." He nodded and went back inside. She reached over, her fingers brushing the armrest of her father's chair. It was cool now, but solid, real. The air smelled faintly of coffee and pine, just as it had that last evening. For the first time, the sight of that empty chair didn't break her. It steadied her, because now she understood. It wasn't a symbol of absence. It was a promise. The kind that said love once given doesn't vanish. It just changes seats. The funeral was quiet, just the way David would have wanted it. No grand speeches, no choir, no procession of people pretending to know him better than they did. Just a handful of faces under a pale gray sky. Emily, Michael, a few neighbors from his building, and the pastor who had met him only once. The wind moved softly through the trees, brushing against the rows of headstones. Somewhere nearby, a crow called, low and distant, as if marking the moment. The scent of damp soil and rain lingered, heavy enough to breathe in. Emily stood closest to the casket. Her hands were clasped in front of her, fingers white from holding too tightly. She didn't cry, not yet. The grief felt too large for tears, like an ocean pressing quietly against the walls of her chest, waiting for a crack to break through. The pastor spoke briefly, something about peace, about love that endures. Emily only half heard it. Her mind drifted to the porch, the two chairs, the last conversation they'd shared. The way his hand had rested over hers, warm and trembling. The sound of him breathing beside her, the steadiness of it, as though he'd finally made peace with the world. When the pastor's voice faded, a hush settled. All that remained was the soft thud of the first handful of earth hitting the wood. Emily flinched at the sound. Then she stepped forward, knees unsteady, and placed a folded letter on top of the casket. It wasn't one of his old letters. It was hers, unsent like all of his. She had written it the night before. The words were simple. "You were right, Dad. Some things don't need to be said out loud to be true. Thank you for loving me in silence. I heard you finally." The paper fluttered slightly in the wind before resting still. After the burial, most people left quickly. Even Michael hung back at a distance, giving her space. She remained where she was, her boots sinking slightly into the soft earth. It began to drizzle again, thin, cold drops that darkened the soil around the grave. She tilted her face toward the sky, closing her eyes as the rain touched her skin. It felt like absolution, not loud or dramatic, just steady, like everything he'd ever done. She whispered into the air, "I forgive you." The words came easily, and for the first time she realized she wasn't just forgiving him. She was forgiving herself for the years she hadn't asked, for the distance she'd helped keep alive, for believing silence meant indifference. The rain fell harder for a moment, as if in response. That evening she returned to his apartment one last time. The landlord had given her a week to sort through his things. The place smelled faintly of wood polish and time, a scent that belonged more to memory than to space. She moved slowly through each room, packing small pieces of him into boxes. Books marked with notes in the margins, a mug with a chip on the handle, the faded photo of her at 6 years old, still tacked above his workbench. When she opened the wooden box beneath his bed, her breath caught. The letters, dozens of them, still tied with the same worn rubber band. She sat on the floor, the weight of the box in her lap. For a long while she didn't open it. She simply ran her fingers over the edges, feeling the texture of the paper, the faint scent of cedar that clung to it. Then slowly she untied the band. The first envelope was dated September 14, 2008. Her 13th birthday. "I don't know what kind of cake you picked this year, kiddo, but I hope it's chocolate. You always liked chocolate. I wanted to call, but I don't want to make her angry. Just know that I'm proud of you more than you'll ever guess." Her throat tightened. She read the next one. And the next. Each letter carried a piece of a man she'd never fully known, fragments of fatherhood sent into the void, hoping they might land somewhere near her heart. By the 10th letter she was crying, quietly without sound, the way grief moves when it stops trying to be dramatic and starts being honest. The rain outside tapped lightly against the window, steady as breathing. She kept reading until the words blurred together, until she couldn't tell where one letter ended and another began. When she finally stopped, she pressed her forehead against the pile and whispered, "I got them all, Dad, every one of them." She spent the night there, unable to leave. At some point, she must have fallen asleep on the couch. When she woke, dawn had begun to stretch pale gold across the room. The light fell softly on the two chairs outside the window, his old wooden one and the new one he'd made for her. The rain had stopped, leaving tiny beads of water clinging to the armrests. For a moment, it looked like the world itself had paused, waiting for her to notice. She stepped outside barefoot, the boards cool against her feet. Air smelled of wet earth and coffee. She sat in her chair and looked at his, empty, still, but not lonely. There was no wind, no birdsong, no sound at all except her breath. "Hi, Dad," she said softly, and the words didn't echo this time. They settled, they stayed. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out one of his old letters, the very last one he'd written, dated late autumn, just a month before he passed. If I don't make it to see your new life begin, just know I was always cheering from somewhere quiet. Some loves don't ask to be seen, Em. They just hope to be remembered kindly. Her hand trembled as she folded the paper back. She placed it gently on the seat of his chair, weighing it down with her wedding ring not as a goodbye but as a gesture of faith. Then she slipped the ring back on, the metal cool against her skin as if closing a circle. Then she whispered through the hush of the morning, "I remember you kindly." A breeze rose, soft and warm, brushing her hair across her face. The letter stirred just slightly as though something invisible had accepted the words. And for the first time since he'd gone, Emily smiled. Not the kind of smile that hides pain. The kind that comes when forgiveness finally finds a home. Quiet, wordless, and complete. The years after David's passing didn't erase his absence, but they reshaped it from an ache that hollowed Emily out into a quiet space she carried gently like something sacred. Life continued as it always does. The seasons changed over the vineyard where she'd once said her vows. The vines grew thicker, the soil richer, the air heavier with memory. And every so often when she visited Hillstone, she'd drive past the road that led to his old apartment, a narrow lane lined with overgrown pines and rust-colored mailboxes, and she'd slow the car just a little, not to stop, just to listen, to that stillness that somehow sounded like him. 5 years later, Emily became a mother. It was early spring when she brought her son home, a small, wrinkled bundle of breath and possibility. The world seemed quieter that week, as if even time had paused to let her adjust to its new rhythm. One afternoon, while Michael was at work and the baby slept beside her, she took out the old wooden box, the one that had followed her from apartment to house, the one that still smelled faintly of cedar and coffee. Inside, the letters remained exactly as she'd packed them, uncreased, untouched, waiting. She chose one at random, unfolded it with care. The handwriting was faint now, the ink softened by years, but the words were still steady like his voice. "If you ever have a child, Em, I hope they teach you what patience really means. The kind that doesn't come from waiting for things, but from loving them enough to stay even when it's hard." She smiled, tears catching in her lashes. She looked over at her son, his small chest rising and falling, his fingers curling unconsciously, and she whispered, "Dad, you'd like him." The baby stirred softly, as if the name had reached some invisible part of the room. A month later, she took him to the vineyard. It was early morning, the fields wrapped in mist, dew glittering across the grass like scattered glass. She walked slowly toward the edge of the property where a small plaque stood now. Bronze, simple, marked with a name few visitors would recognize. David R. Davis, 1959-2024. Some loves don't ask to be seen. They just hope to be remembered kindly. She knelt down, tracing the letters with her fingers, the metal cool against her skin. Her son gurgled softly in her arms, his tiny hands grasping at her necklace, same heart-shaped pendant she'd worn on her wedding day. "Do you hear that?" she whispered to him. The wind moved gently through the vines, rustling the leaves in slow, rhythmic waves. It sounded almost like breathing. "That's him," she said. "That's your grandpa." She smiled through the tears that rose, not out of pain now, but out of gratitude, because she could finally feel him everywhere, not just in memory, but in the quiet persistence of love that refuses to end. Years later, when her son turned 6, he asked about the 2 chairs on their porch. By then the chairs had become a fixture, the same way sunlight through the kitchen window or the smell of cinnamon on Sunday mornings had. "Why do we have 2 if only you sit there?" he asked. Emily smiled. "Because sometimes love still needs a place to sit," she said. The boy tilted his head, thinking deeply in that way children do, and then climbed into the empty chair beside her. "Then I'll sit with it," he declared. And in that simple act, that innocent gesture, she felt her father's story continue, not as a wound, but as a lineage of quiet, unseen kindness. The years softened even further. Time aged her gently, the way sea glass turns sharp edges into smooth color. She learned to live with the empty chair, the way one lives with breath, not always noticing it, but always depending on it. It reminded her that love is not about presence alone, but about persistence, about the invisible work that happens long after words fall silent, about showing up, even if all you can do is pay a debt quietly or build a chair that someone else will one day fill. Sometimes when she spoke at community events about her work, now as a family counselor, She shared fragments of her story. Never names, never specifics. Just the truth that silence, when paired with love, can be misunderstood, but it can also be redemptive. She'd tell her students, forgiveness doesn't always sound like a conversation. Sometimes it's an act, a gesture, a decision you make alone in a room because the person you need to forgive isn't there anymore, or can't be. And when they asked if she forgave her father, she always smiled softly and said, I didn't need to. He never asked for it. He just lived in a way that taught me what it really meant. One evening, after putting her son to bed, she sat on the porch with a cup of tea. The air smelled faintly of rain, and the crickets hummed their steady song. The two chairs sat side by side, hers and the one she would never move. The wind picked up slightly, carrying the distant sound of a train horn across the hills. She closed her eyes and smiled. He was there again, not as a ghost, not as memory, but as rhythm, the pulse of life still moving forward, quietly faithful. She whispered into the air, "Good night, Dad," and this time, the silence that followed didn't hurt. It answered, reflection, the lesson we take home. Sometimes the people who love us most don't know how to say it the way we expect. They build chairs instead of conversations. They send help instead of hugs. They stand in the shadows, hoping we'll someday notice the light that still reaches us. We live in a world that measures love by words. How often we say I love you, how loudly we show up, how visible our care can be. But there's another kind of love. The quiet, ordinary, inconvenient kind. The kind that doesn't announce itself but endures. If this story found you tonight, maybe it's because you've had your own empty chair. Someone you've lost, someone you've misunderstood, or maybe you've been that person yourself. And if so, this is your reminder. It's never too late to forgive without words, to reach out, to rebuild, or simply to remember someone kindly, even if they are no longer here to hear it. Forgiveness doesn't rewrite the past. It reclaims it so it can stop hurting and start teaching. So tonight, if someone's face crossed your mind while listening to this story, don't ignore it, call them. Write to them, or if words are too hard, just do something kind, quietly, anonymously. Let love travel the way it needs to, without expectation, without applause, because in the end, the truest forms of love aren't the ones we speak. They're the ones we keep showing up for. Thank you truly for staying with this story until the very end. If the empty chair touched you in any way, if it reminded you of someone, or helped you see forgiveness differently, please take a moment to share it with someone who might need to hear it too. And if you'd like to keep journeying with us through stories that explore love, loss, and the quiet ways families heal, make sure to subscribe, tap that bell icon, and stay close to this little corner of warmth we're building together. From my heart to yours, thank you for listening, for feeling, and for remembering that even silence can hold love. May you have peace tonight. May your home be gentle, your heart forgiving, and every empty chair in your life become a place where love still sits quietly, waiting to be seen. Good night. And may your family, wherever they are, be blessed, whole, and always remembered kindly.